Well, it's finally done. My biggest project so far has finally come to a close. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minute, and welcome back to the workbench. Join me as I complete this final episode of my Airfix 1/24th scale Grumman Hellcat. And in this one I'm going to be adding some finishing touches and rounding it off with a review. So let's get this down onto the workbench. I'm not going to mess about in this video. I think I'm just going to get straight into it. We're going to get some final bits added onto the model, give it a little bit more weight. In the previous episode, the majority of the build was done. It was pretty much in an out-of-the-box kind of standard, but now it's just to go a little bit further and add a few extra elements. As with the other parts in this build, I'll add a list of the products I used during this particular section on the screen, so that you can have an idea of what to go and get if you fancy having a go at this for yourself. So first up, I've got this US light green. This is kind of the same colour as the internal cockpit area. And what I decided to do is a bit of a layered kind of chipping effect. I've got a sponge with some of this paint on, and I've decided that as the first step I'm going to add a bit of chipping to make it appear that in certain places the paint has been worn away and is now revealing the primer colour. This was done in some select places, such as where the pilot and crew may walk on the aircraft wing to access it, and around any panels such as the gun bays, which may have had regular access in order to rearm, refuel, or repair the aircraft. I also thought that because of the way that air is quite abrasive when an aircraft is flying at like 300 miles an hour, that some of the paint on the leading edge of the wings may also have been stripped away. So I sort of simulated this using a paintbrush here. Next up is this Primer Grey 01, and I repeated the exact same process I've just done. This is going to add a further kind of contrast and add a little bit of visual interest to the chipping that I've already done. This was applied in pretty much the same places, just adding a further layer. And then the final one was some polished metal from MiG. And again, this was applied in pretty much the exact same places, but this time showing a further effect where the paint has been worn away and the bare metal is now being displayed. I would use a fine brush to do this one to try and get some fairly neat control of it. This was applied to all of the areas where I thought heavy use and traffic from personnel climbing over the aircraft would have worn the paint down to the metalwork. I did apply some of this to the propeller as well, as I imagine that whilst this is spinning it would wear some of the paint off due to air resistance. With that done, this SMS dark brown enamel wash was applied to the entire aircraft. I actually did thin this down with a little white spirit as I thought it a little thick straight out of the bottle. But on the whole, a large wide brush was used to apply it to the entire aircraft, and as this has recessed panel lines and other details, it should run into those and add a further layer of grime, adding some shadow and contrast as well. Once that was done, I took a sponge with some white spirit on it and then brushed the aircraft in the direction of airflow to remove any excess wash. Hopefully all the stuff in the recessed areas should remain, and as I'm wiping in the direction of airflow, it should kind of add to the effect. This was a rather therapeutic stage, but I did have to take care not to be too overzealous with this. I was concerned that if I added too much of this, I could run the risk of peeling any paintwork. But fortunately, I didn't experience any of that. Areas where I would go a little bit heavier and potentially not wipe it away was in the gun bays and those panels, and also on the visible engine elements. In particular, some of the panels around the engine may be a little bit dirtier. With that done, the Humbrol 01 Primer Grey makes a reappearance. Having left all of that wash to dry, I then dry brushed this grey paint over all of the detail areas. This should help add a further level of highlight. A small amount of paint was applied to the paintbrush, and then it was rubbed on a piece of paper to remove the majority of the paint so that it felt dry. I then brushed this paint, with its residue, over the various raised details, and those raised details will catch the paint. I did this over all the various panels and any areas where there were raised details. The effect isn't overly obvious, but it does give a nice subtle look. I think it is particularly noticeable on the gun bay areas. I would of course not forget the landing gear wheels, as they do have some nice tread work that I would like to become visible. There are also some little rivets and things on the prop which I thought would look quite nice, picked out with some dry brushing. I do have this Humbrol oil stain wash which is a little bit glossy, and this was applied to any of the areas where it seemed to be that there was some sort of oil or fuel filler. This was added onto the aircraft with a fine brush and then sort of smeared around in two different directions. The first direction was the direction the fuel would flow when the aircraft is sat on the ground, and the second is the direction it would flow when the aircraft is flying. I'm not entirely sure what this reservoir is inside of the aircraft. I think it is a fuel tank, but I just decided to add some oil to this instead. It may well be a water tank for the engine, but either way it's got a bit of a grimy look to it now. A free sample that Humbrol sent out for me to try a little while ago is these Humbrol aging powders. These are weathering powder pigments, and so far they've been working relatively okay for me. I used some of the black and smoke pigments to replicate exhaust staining. Some of the pigments were applied to a dry brush, added close to the area where the exhaust would be expelled, and then streaked backwards along the airframe. The different colours would be applied at different times to try and build up the effect. I did this in the areas where the engine exhausts were, and would also apply some in other select areas such as around the gun ports. Humbrol Clear Fix makes a reappearance here, and actually I hadn't glued in the rear cockpit part in the last episode. I had pretty much just placed it in place. I left it off so I could complete this weathering, but it was glued into place finally at this step. Now I'm going to add some aerial. I've got some of this Ushy Rig That Thing fine elastic thread, and to attach it to the model I used some super glue. The super glue was added onto the aerial mast, then the rigging wire was glued into place. I would hold it until the glue had dried. Once the glue had dried, it would then be stretched to the next contact point, where again some more glue would be applied, the wire, now stretched, added onto it, and then it would be held until the glue dried. Once the glue had dried, the excess would be cut away. I would repeat this process for where it actually goes into the fuselage, running it from the fuselage point and gluing it to where it meets the main aerial wire. This was a rather fine wire, and I actually think that perhaps I could have used a thicker grade, as in the final images it's not particularly visible. In order to do some weathering on the propeller, I had actually removed it from the last video, but here I added it, and at this point I'm calling my Hellcat build in 1/24 complete. And there it is, not particularly adventurous weathering, but I think these extra final steps just add an extra bit of weight. I probably could have gone and done more bits and pieces with this. I mean, this is the kind of kit that you could sit down and spend weeks working on each individual component to make it look absolutely amazing, and I'm sure that there are people out there who've done that. This build took me about 3 months to complete, and it's definitely the biggest project that I've done so far on my channel. I am generally pretty happy with how mine looks. I was a bit sort of put off by how complicated the kit looked, but now that I've built it, it's given me a new kind of confidence that I feel like I could go and do other kits as well, or at least similar ones with the same kind of level of complexity. There are of course extra bits and pieces you can go and buy for this kit to further upgrade it, such as for the engine, for the cockpit. I think there are even like aftermarket parts you can get for different armaments. As mentioned, I think RP3 rockets might be available online somewhere, perhaps as a 3D printable file. But I pretty much went for an out-of-the-box kind of build with a few little extra bits and pieces. As mentioned, I think we need to just talk a little bit about the kit and wrap this up as a review. So this kit dates from 2019, and although it is a very impressive model, it doesn't quite have the finesse or quality that a kit from more recent years, such as 2023 or 2024 has. I have no doubt in my mind that this kind of kit has influenced those sort of designs. The lessons learned from this model no doubt have had some impact and bearing on the current standard of Airfix kits. I found the moulding to be really good, the level of detail was pretty great, there wasn't anything really in the way of flash that needed cleaning up, and those cartograph decals applied to the model really well, with their printing being great and the film not leaving much in the way of silvering. If there was any silvering, it was probably my fault. Featuring nearly 600 parts, it's no wonder that this kit is not exactly the cheapest one in the world. I believe at the time of release this was around £129.99 here in the UK, but I can't find an RRP for definite. All I know is that I paid £114.99 for this a couple of years ago. Thanks of course to the crowdfunding effort that these guys on screen donated to in order to see this project be brought to life, so thanks massively to these people on screen. If however you did want to get one of these for yourself today though, at the time I'm making this video, it hasn't yet had a re-release, so this does only seem to be available on the second-hand market, and on the second-hand market you can be looking upwards of over £200, which in my opinion is not really the direction you want to go with this one. A lot of people have been asking Airfix for a re-release of this kit, so perhaps we'll see one soon, or at least in a couple of years. One of the things that I really did struggle with in this kit though is the fit of the parts. A lot of the parts, although designed really well, have a really tight fit, like the fit is like exact, it's like right. If one thing was a millimeter long, the other thing was a millimeter to go, you know, like they were the same. There was like no sort of flex. So if you didn't get something to fit early in the build, it was likely that later on, because there's more, you add more and you add more and you add more, it would snowball. And that's what I've experienced with some of the panel work on the nose. The panels don't quite fit perfectly. There is a small gap. It's like less than a millimeter, but that's probably because like a small gap here has led to a slightly larger gap, and then a slightly larger gap, and so on and so forth. So with this kit, I think you just have to test fit everything if you are going to have one to get it all to fit together. I know I had struggles with the fuselage joining together. I know other people had problems with the wings. It's just because those tolerances are so tight that if you aren't dry fitting every step, you are going to probably find that it will snowball and cause further gaps. But in my example, I managed to fill most of the gaps, and I don't think they're so noticeable at the end of the build. I think though it's probably time to wrap this one up here. I'm so happy that I've finally been able to build this one and show you guys my results. I think this big project has given me a little bit more confidence to go and find other big projects to do, but naturally they do take quite a lot of time. So let me know down in the comments what you think of my build, and any other suggestions for big projects that you might like to see me do on my channel. As always, a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them or support the channel in other ways, full information is below the video. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, the last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. Areas where I would go a little bit heavier. And Hellcat, final episode, part 6. A little bit loud. A little bit loud that time. But I think these extra final steps just but I think these... I am super buzzed. I'm so happy that...